During the Gilded Age, you had the development of what is known as the political machine, and the political machine would hold people within a community accountable for their votes, and in exchange for a vote, they would give them work and a place to live. Now, this wasn't a free place, and this wasn't really high wages, but it was something for survival. And the definition of a political machine is an organized group that controlled the activities of a political party in a city. You're going to see this a lot in places like Baltimore, New York City, San Francisco, and Boston, where these political machines really control the votes. They provided services in exchange for money and votes. The political machine was divided into a hierarchy where the city boss is at the top, and we're going to talk about a city boss in a second. But the city boss would be at the top, and he would be in charge of an entire city. The ward boss would be in charge of a particular area of the city, and then you would have the local precinct workers and captains, and they would run maybe a couple streets or a couple of blocks under the ward boss. So the captains answered to the ward boss, and the ward boss answered to the city boss, and their job was to get those votes from the people living in the cities. So they would give jobs to people, and they would say, because we gave you a job, you need to vote for these particular people to be in power. The role of the political boss was to control municipal jobs and business licenses. So unless you were in good with a political boss, you couldn't get a local business license to open your own business. And oftentimes, if you offered to vote for a certain person or give them money, they would give you that license. They also influenced courts and municipal agencies. They also solved urban problems to gain the favor of the voters, so that the voters actually liked them. They would do things like work on sewer systems, build parks, create strong waterworks, build schools and hospitals, so that people would be encouraged to vote for them. You see a political cartoon right here, and you need to pay close attention to this one because you're going to see it again. This is actually a boss Tweed. He's a city boss, and it shows, this is by Thomas Nast, where he is standing next to a ballot box, and the top part says the ballot, and in counting there is strength. So they could count the votes in a fraudulent way in order to get the results that they wanted. Immigrants were the main group of people that helped support this political machine. Many political bosses were first or second generation immigrants, but as they grew in power, they would abuse the rights of many of these immigrants. They could help the immigrants become naturalized citizens, which was the main goal of these people. The bosses often spoke the languages of the immigrants coming in and were able to create a relationship with them. So why exactly would these bosses help them? Because they wanted their vote. So it was more for them than it was for the immigrants. Graft played a huge part in the role of political bosses, and as the influence of political bosses grew, so did the susceptibility to corruption, especially when it came to graft. Now, the definition of graft is the illegal use of political influence for personal gain. So, through graft, you help a person find work, i.e. a construction project. So the political boss would be friends with someone who owned a construction company. The political boss is in the process of building a new hospital, and so he would take his friend and offer him the job. But behind closed doors, he would tell the contractor to bill for more than the project actually cost. So if the project was actually only going to cost $50 million, the contractor would bill them for $75 million. And that extra money that the boss paid the contractor would be split between the contractor and the boss in a form of a kickback. They would, and this would allow for a lot of money in the pockets of the political bosses. And the construction companies were willing to do it because it gave them jobs. After a while, political machines couldn't just rely on voters, so they turned to fraud. You would see what we saw in the last political cartoon, where they would fix the elections, they would count the votes they wanted to, they would stuff ballot boxes in order to get what they wanted. So through this fraud and graft, the political machines were really controlling the cities. Even up until 1890, police officers were hired and fired by political bosses. So they even had the police department in their back pocket in order to do what they needed to do. And in order to get support from different businesses, they would ignore illegal activities of a business for payment. So if a business was allowing gambling to go on in their back doors, they would ignore it in exchange for a payment. One of the most famous political bosses was Boss Tweed, who was located in New York City, and he was the head of a political machine called Tammany Hall. One of his biggest scandals was the construction of a New York County courthouse, where the construction was only going to cost $3 million, but through graft, he had them overcharge $13 million, and the taxpayers who were paying for the building of that building paid the difference, and so he had a kickback of $10 million on that particular project. And remember, because this is something you're going to have to be familiar with, Boss Tweed was someone you saw in that political cartoon earlier in this presentation, but very, very corrupt. He would eventually be sentenced to prison for 12 years. He would escape, but was caught again in Spain. And he was recognized because of the number of political cartoons that were published about him, and people could see what he looked like. They couldn't read. Many people couldn't read, but they could look at a cartoon, and they recognized his picture. And so in Spain, he was caught and returned and had to finish his sentence. There were 3 big scandals during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, who was president of the United States from 1869 to 1877. The first scandal is the whiskey ring that occurred in 1875. After the Civil War, liquor taxes were raised. Large distilleries, these were the places that make the liquor, bribed government officials so that they could keep some of the tax proceeds. 110 people would eventually be convicted of tax fraud during this whiskey ring scandal. Then in 1869, you have Grant's Black Friday. There was economic panic in 1869. During the Civil War, money was, or actually prior to the Civil War, money was backed by gold, so you could exchange your money for gold. But during the Civil War, money was not backed by gold. And after the war, many people wanted to exchange their money for gold because they saw more value in having the actual gold than paper money. Because the value of gold was going to go up tremendously because there wasn't enough for everybody, 2 men who were acquaintances of Grant wanted to make a profit by buying up all the gold. In order to do this, they convinced Grant to appoint a friend as the treasurer of the United States, and they were able to control that gold. The last scandal, one of the last big scandals during the Grant presidency occurred in 1872, and it was the Credit Mobilier scandal. Now, this involved the Union Pacific Railroad, and the Union Pacific Railroad would sell stock or ownership of their railroad to congressmen at a discounted rate. And so congressmen would own part of the railroad, and in exchange for that discounted rate, they would pass legislation and vote in favor of actions for the Union Pacific Railroad. So all 3 of these scandals occurred during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, I've mentioned him before, but Thomas Nast was a cartoonist who would draw political cartoons depicting the corruption of the political corruption of the Gilded Age. His political cartoons brought the corruption in the political machines to the attention of the federal government. Again, a lot of people could not read, but they could look at the pictures and interpret what was going on, and many of the political bosses lost favor because of this. For example, his cartoons had so much influence that in Boss Tweed was in trouble in 1871. Info about his doings were turned over to the New York Times, and Boss Tweed offered $5 million to not publish the story, and he even offered Nast $500,000 to stop drawing pictures of him. and his corruption, but Nast refused. And again, like we said before, it was because of Nast cartoons that someone was able to recognize Tweed when he escaped from jail and was found in Spain. So the overall point is Thomas Nast drew cartoons that depicted the corruption of the political machine during the Gilded Age. Since the early 19th century, people were given government jobs based on patronage. The definition of patronage is you reward one of your supporters, so maybe someone that helped you get elected with a government job. So you may not necessarily be qualified for that particular job, but because you helped that person get elected, they gave you a job in the government. This was known as the spoils system under Andrew Jackson. Reformers wanted to change this because they thought civil service jobs should go to those most qualified, not to those who just did someone a favor. After Grant was president, Rutherford B. Hayes was president in 1876. Hayes was a Republican, and Republicans were not necessarily associated with reform, but Hayes wanted reform, especially when it came to patronage, which again was when you reward your supporters for government jobs. Hayes believed that you should be qualified. Now, because he was a Republican and many Republicans disagreed with this, they put a lot of pressure on him. But Hayes refused to give in to that pressure. He wanted reform, but Congress didn't, so he named independents to his cabinet positions. He also set up a commission to investigate cases of patronage. He chose not to rerun for President of the United States. At this point, the Republicans were called stalwarts, and it was mainly in the next presidential election, it would be the stalwarts versus the reformers. An independent nominee would come out, Garfield. Now, Garfield was a reformer, but in order to balance the ticket, he ran with Vice President Arthur, or hopeful Vice President Arthur, who was not a reformer. And they thought that with these two together, he could get elected. Well, Garfield was elected in 1880 as an independent candidate, and Arthur was his vice president. But in 1881, he was assassinated by a lawyer that felt that he should have been given a job because of his support for Garfield. His name was Charles Guiteau, and after he shot him, he said, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is now president," because he thought that once Arthur became vice president, that he would stop the reforms going through. But Guiteau's assassination actually had the exact opposite effect that he hoped it would have by stopping reform. Instead, it brought to light that reform needed to be made in the United States, and as a result of his assassination, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. And this is something you need to know, the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. And this made it where people were given civil service jobs based on merit. No longer could it be on a system of patronage. As a result, you would have an honest government, and politicians turned to other means for money. Arthur, who Guiteau hoped would stop reform, actually turned into a reformer because of the assassination. After President Arthur, you have President Cleveland. He was elected in 1884. He was the first Democrat in 28 years to be elected. He wanted lower tariffs, but Congress did not support this. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. By lowering tax on imported goods, it made foreign goods competitive with American goods. Big businesses didn't want lower tariffs because of that, because it created more competition. After Grover Cleveland, you have Benjamin Harris, who's elected in 1888, and he wanted higher tariffs. And he passed the McKinley Tariff Act, which were the highest tariffs yet. Harrison's election was actually funded by companies wanting the higher tariffs. Then Grover Cleveland was re-elected in 1892. 1892, I'm sorry. He's the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. That means he did not serve back to back. And again, remember, the Gilded Age was a time that was a success for the few, political corruption, and little worth for the many.